So, welcome to the podcast, Cliff.
Thank you.
For listeners who haven't checked out the show notes yet, roughly who are you? What do you do?
My name is Cliff, and I help a bunch of companies that are scaling really fast do strategy deployments in a way that doesn't make the wheels fall off the company. Specifically, companies are growing really fast. So, you're 200 today and you're 700 by the end of the year. How do you do that? And sort of develop the organization to be sort of learning and evolving itself rather than just panicking when things go wrong and then someone comes in from outside or from the top and says, this is how we do it now.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, it felt very, very, very interesting to me because the company where I work, we've roughly doubled, or a bit more than double in size during the pandemic from about 25 to about 70 people.
Yeah.
So I think we're in the stage where we don't yet know what problems we're about to have. I'm pretty sure we will be having problems we haven't discovered yet.
I think that's the thing, is that some of those things you can learn. So my expertise is not in sort of how the company should be organized, but recognizing that there's certain tools and models, but also specifically like certain points. So, when you start adding your second or third layer of management, that leads to a whole set of changes. I was the CTO who used to write code.
Yeah.
Now I'm 2 levels removed from the problems. There's 45 people who build the thing.
Yeah.
That's a different problem to how do I manage the person who builds the code, but I also still code on the side kind of thing. And you go through all of these challenges. Now we want to set a vision. How do we work with all the people who also need to contribute to that? And they need to be able to execute from it. It's not the same as a technical decision or something in the weeds that you used to do.
Yeah. And and there will always be lots of people who weren't involved in the discussion.
Yeah.
Rather than where you can just gather around a pot of coffee and everyone was sort of aligned automatically.
And exactly that, because I mean, at some level, people sort of think like, oh, well, you create this sort of FOMO, like people have to be involved in everything, but that actually often creates more of a problem because you end up either with a design by committee or it takes so long. And so finding a good balance of like, how do you involve people without necessarily having to have all of us, especially in a post-COVID world where getting everybody on a Zoom call to talk about the strategy for the company, I don't know that that's going to be a very productive conversation.
No.
So fragmented into some smaller pieces, and we talk in groups and we feedback and roll up and roll down and like integrate again. And so, it's similar to the problems of product development if you treat it that way. Like, we need to separate and connect again.
Yeah, and sort of trust that things are being figured out in the proper places.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like that's one stage that I've gone through various times probably. It's like, I know this is something someone should be thinking about. I'm pretty sure it's not me, but I don't know who it is, and I don't know if they're doing it or not.
Yes.
Because I don't yet know what the structure is.
Yeah.
Things have changed.
So we do a lot of that work with flight level specifically. What I use is sort of this metaphor of saying, okay, there's some human beings need to work together. Usually the construct for that is something like a team or a squad or something. But the challenge becomes most companies that are doing these things are not necessarily thinking as much between the teams or between the functions and departments. So if we say, well, there's a bunch of software teams that need to build a product, but there's also a legal, compliance, whatever, there is marketing, there's sales, so on. How do we connect them a little bit into that conversation so that they're not finding out 6 weeks before release date when they've bought television advertising or something that it doesn't work the way we thought it did, or it's not 7 times faster in all cases, it's actually only 4 times faster in average case. And so, let's build something, a level of abstraction above that can say, this is the place where if I'm not sure, should I be thinking about that problem, I can go to that place and say, who's thinking about this? Oh, you are, cool, then I leave it to you. Or I have some thoughts. I was wondering if you'd considered this thing.
That really rang a bell as well. I mean, the problem being between parts of the organization. Because
Exactly.
I feel like when it comes to scaling our development side, with the engineering side, we've been able to do it in a pretty nice way because we've seen the demand for a position before we had it. Like, we really should have a manager for this thing. It would be so great to have one. And then we get one, and then it's all good. But between the engineering and other parts, you notice that, we put someone in place over here who's supposed to deal with that. The other organization parts, they don't really know that yet. So they come to me directly, and I don't know where to give things to them yet. So it's really this inter-org section thing.
There's another one that I've seen as well, which is a common one within a domain of specialization. So it could be software developers building a tool that other software developers use, or marketing does something for marketing, HR does something for HR. And the situation there is often that because you are close enough to a user, you assume that you are the user. And so you tend to not talk as much to the real user. And so you build this thing that is sort of I don't say a castle in the sky, but it's like, it makes some coherent sense, but then actually connecting it back and going, does it solve your problem? Was that even the challenge that you faced? So rather than, if you want to understand horses, don't sit in a room and think, what would I do if I was a horse? Go and watch what horses do. It makes a lot of sense.
It does. And reading up on books that other people have written about horses.
Exactly. And then even when they were writing those books, they weren't actually watching horses. So it's two layers of...
Yeah. And it makes... it's so easy to leave process changes and stuff at those boundaries in organizations as well.
Yeah.
It feels like, and that's also one of those questions, who should be in charge, so to speak, of spreading that so we're moving even more in conjunction than we were before.
I think that's the challenge, is that we design a lot of the structures around, so marketing has a department and they work well within marketing. And that makes sense because, marketing people should have some common interactions and talk to each other. But then, to talk across that silo to the people who build the product or the people who sell the product and talk to the customers as opposed to the market in general, it becomes an interesting set of challenges because we tend to over-index on the sort of functional groupings. I think it's a case of just trying to, without overloading people with 1,000 meetings to report status about 200 things no one cares about, how do we bring you together to have a meaningful conversation? Say, are you thinking about this problem? Okay, cool.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like for our case, we have had pretty good success with, temporary small teams, but I don't think we have a structure in place for working that way regularly. It's always sort of in the back of your head that this is a temporary thing, and then we're going back to whatever that is. And that actually works slightly worse. In general, it works nicely because you plan in a different way and you look ahead a bit more. But whenever you involve a small team focused on something, you get a whole different energy. So I don't know, maybe it's it seems a bit chaotic from one side, but on the other side, maybe I guess that's what we should be trending toward.
I think it's a little bit more like, rather than trying to control the ocean, learning to surf. And, you can surf in many different ways. You can get a kite, you can get a windsurfer, you can surf on a surfboard, you can take a bodyboard, you can go diving. There's a lot of different ways to approach that. But the thing is that if you somehow try to control the waves, the waves get bigger, you get some seasonal storm, something changes. And that's the challenge, is that you have to find a little bit of how do we recognize, okay, there's a swell coming, what should we do about that? In a sensible manner. And I think that's it's a really interesting space because people I was actually just talking now when we were downstairs over lunch, I was saying about when companies have a major issue, something, I don't know, you had a forecast about hiring people and the team was onboarding at a rate far ahead of what the company needed. I think we've seen a lot of this in the last couple of weeks with a lot of big tech companies laying off staff and so on. And a lot of that is just it's a lag between the point where you realize that things are not going according to plan. You could have had that information somehow earlier and maybe course corrected a little bit. But the challenge is, how do you react to that? And layoffs is one piece, and I'm not talking so much about that, but how do you actually create a situation where you can address a problem without necessarily sort of taking a large hammer and policing the hell out of everything so that nothing can ever go wrong again? It's you actually do want a little bit of freedom so that the boundaries can kind of flex a little bit. So rather than being, if you do this, you're going to get fired. You have those things. You punch a colleague in the face. Fine. Probably you don't stay working here for very long. But the difference between negligent and non-negligent, we took a chance, it was a calculated risk, something didn't work out as planned. How do we address it systemically rather than blaming, shaming, that kind of thing? I see a lot of companies actually struggling because they do that in a bad way. Look for somebody to punish. And, I don't know.
We're not supposed to come up with all the perfect answer.
Yeah. But I think people also take it to the opposite extreme and go, well, you can't ever have a hard conversation with someone. Like, hey, your job is actually to know better than this. Like, you shouldn't have been making silly decisions like that. And the problem is that we tend to skew in one direction or the other. And like very often you like, come on, dude, like,
Yeah. I mean, it's and then we build up some nice process and structure to make things move forward in a nice pace and with a reasonable amount of bugs or lack of bugs. And then something special happens. And then if someone tries to bring up the process for testing the release properly, it's like, yes, but this is important. Do you know how angry that person is right now? And then everyone's sort of okay for a little while, suddenly it's like suspending this way of working that we've been discussing for so long.
Yeah, it's always a challenge. I mean, there's so many different perspectives that need to come together to make something work. And I think too often it's like we run the risk. I think you see it in a number of different ways, but it's sort of like if you get to a point where you see the other side as inherently evil or against you, that you've already gone too far. And that's the challenge because, you know, it's now a war rather than actually like, I mean, I find it fascinating. Companies, like you're all actually on the same side. And your competitor is external. And yet so much of the constructs and the way that companies actually behave is like, you know, I'm fighting you for the promotion, I'm fighting you for this idea because I want status or whatever. And like, I mean, I get it. Like some of that is going to be inherent in the system, but certainly don't try to amplify and make more of that if you can. So
and it takes so few people to fall into that trap as well. I mean, I've had much more of it in much smaller organizations than one I am in now. You just need to take a few wrong turns to start going in that direction. And you can accelerate pretty fast all of a sudden. Away from talking to.
I have to be careful because it can slide quite quickly now.
So I'm just curious, how did you end up in this area of work?
So I did a couple of things. I'm originally a network engineer by training. So I built large IP networks back in the day, ended up in telecoms, and then made a transition from that to actually in the management space, leading teams, leading companies, that kind of thing. And from that experience, realized that there's a lot of similarities. I mean, there's huge differences as well between like technological networks and like human interactions, but there are some common ground metaphors, but I enjoyed sort of the messiness and the complexity of the human side of things. And then through the journey, ended up sort of in a space where I learned about some of the agile stuff, and it kind of evolved a little bit from there. Like I was just frustrated that we were trying to do everything in this way of like, let's make all the decisions at the beginning when we start, when we know the least. And then later when we know more decisions, we're like, we've created this plan that's super hard to change as we learn. I was like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, I mean, I get that we need to have a plan, but also we can't like, we're going to be wrong. And then we make it hard to like change and adapt. So we end up locking in a silly decision. And from that evolution, like learning more about sort of the human side of systems, and as my role changed and working with different companies, basically working more kind of as an agile coach and later sort of as a consultant and leading sort of larger organizational change initiatives, working specifically with the leadership to try to say, you know, it doesn't help to point at the team and say, let's make the team as agile as possible. The organization needs to work in an agile way. What would that look like if, you know, we did budgeting on a more frequent basis, still with a 1-year horizon, but let's update it every month, every quarter, something like this. And how do we get input from people on everything from a product strategy to a restructure to an architectural decision? Like, you know, you can't include 100% of people, but if you don't talk to your tech team and you start a marketing plan for something, probably you find out some things are not quite as possible, or, you know, maybe you find good opportunities as well. It's not just the, like, that's not possible, but actually, if you just want to do this, we could do something in 5 minutes.
Exactly.
And so trying to find ways to have that sort of stuff happen a little bit more. And I think specifically with folks who are in a senior space in an organization, they can influence through their own behavior and modeling certain styles of working that can have huge ripple effects across the organization. So that's what I've been doing.
I mean, as we mentioned before, like when organizations grow bigger and suddenly you have levels in between where you used to have, it feels like your positions there, like being a coach of coaches, or but it was not that must be kind of tricky to keep in touch.
Yeah.
Because I guess you want a lot of inputs from a lot of different places.
Yeah. I think a lot of it is, so I try to work with specifically directly with specific human beings rather than just with a sort of a collection of humans.
Uh-huh.
And so, give you an example. I've worked with leaders who are saying like, well, one of the challenges we face is that everything that goes wrong gets escalated up to us. And we're trying to get the teams to sort of actually take the empowerment that we've sort of given them, but they're not yet exercising it on a frequent enough basis. How do we stop that from always coming back to us? And usually when you start unpacking it, it's several things like, I mean, even as a simple example, like you have budget to travel, but you feel like you need to come and ask my permission before you book that trip.
Yeah.
Why is that? There's something that you feel you need to come and ask me for. So how can we, rather than saying, dude, just book the trip, because that's going to kind of entrain that pattern of behavior, let's work through it and say, well, what is it about this trip or this particular situation that's making you come and ask me? Like, what could I do differently that would enable you to feel like you could just make that decision?
Yeah.
And it'll take some time and some practice, but if you can get to that point and say like, yeah, okay, some decisions, for example, are very hard to reverse. Yeah. Some decisions have large impact. Buying a flight to somewhere, probably not the biggest deal. And so maybe what you say is like, beyond a certain level of spend, just make your own decisions. Above a certain amount, make the decision and let me know, and beyond another amount, check with me before you do anything. And so, those kind of things. Like, I don't care about every flight you booked, but if you spend, $100,000 on something, I want to know about it. But if you need to spend more than $1 million, consult me first.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Like, getting those kind of things into the organization, there's so many different types of decisions that can work with. But if you look at the mechanic and go, well, it's a decision that's coming to me, I want you to make the decision. Pretty soon what you find is that you've deferred all the decision making without actually creating some kind of a space.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. I mean, I realized one of those little things about myself, that the difference for me working pre and post pandemic is that post pandemic, I no longer feel that I need to justify to someone why I'm working from not the office today.
Yeah.
I mean, it's such a big difference and such an uninteresting. It's all inside my head.
Yeah.
I didn't need to explain to anyone before. It wasn't like anyone asked either. And we had plenty of people who traveled a lot before as well. So, but it just made me realize, okay, it was just in my head.
Yeah. I've seen it a couple of times. So on the travel sort of example and working remote, a lot of the time it's just a case of being transparent about stuff. And so it can have two effects. On one hand, I've seen companies open up the travel spend and make that information public. So you're flying all the time. We can see that you spent a ton of money, but we can also see that you're spending 3,000 euros on a dinner with clients for there's 4 of you. You're like, not so cool. So people sort of self-regulate in that situation. The flip side of it, and it can have both positive and negative consequences, you might look at that as somebody who's not doing that and go, well, if they're doing it, I can do it.
Yeah.
And that can be good in the sense that it encourages you to expend the budget that's actually allocated. I mean, yes, the reason we said there's a travel budget is because we want you to go and meet your teammates and get to know them and work with them.
Exactly.
But there's also a limit. And so, keeping an eye a little bit on that and saying, let's share some information, because I think very often just making it public can influence things in quite profound ways. You don't have to have rules and policies. I see you doing it all the time, so I'm like, cool, that's obviously a thing that's acceptable. Yeah. Just make sure that it is a thing that you actually think is acceptable.
Yeah. We need to work on that when it comes to our education and conference budgets. It's one of those classics there was a conference next week that I could have gone to if I had thought about it 2 months ago.
Yeah.
And also we didn't talk about it at work, so no one else is going either.
I've seen it with companies that have this infinite leave policy or whatever. It almost always tends to correlate with a reduction in the amount of leave people take, because they're sort of trying to see what is the norm, and they're used to a prevailing trend. So Scandinavian regions, you tend to take a lot more vacation, so the number would be higher than, say, in the US, where they're used to less. But it just, sometimes you actually want to say, is this a minimum? You should take this much? Yeah. Actually go and take a break, please? Yeah. Or are you trying to, enforce some kind of, well, don't take more than this or whatever? And I don't know, I think we often go about it in ways that create problems rather than what actually happened as a result.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, a lot of this stuff when we talk about it, it feels very like natural, and of course we want to go in that direction. So what kind of? I mean, of course there are challenges everywhere to actually getting there. Are there any particular things that tend to like meet more resistance than others, or is it sort of a constant?
So I'm not sure that it's necessarily resistance in the sense of people saying they don't want to do it, but something that I see a lot of companies really struggling with is the idea of being focused. And I mean, at some level, we all know the more things you do, the slower all of those things take, like the longer they take. But the challenge with that is, of course, that at some level, if you put all your eggs in one basket and then you're wrong, you only have one thing and it's wrong.
Yeah.
So there's a natural tendency to kind of spread your bets around a little bit, but there's a point where too many bets means, you don't win enough on any of the bets, but you also don't get anything enough of that stuff.
Yeah, it's sort of treading water.
Yeah, and so I think this is part of the challenge, is finding a way to be able to do this. And so what I talk about a lot in the organization is not saying, well, we need to get better at picking the bets necessarily, but what we need to be good at doing is actually executing them in some sort of a sequence. So the metaphor that I use is don't let number 3 block number 1. So in my mind, it as a starting point, it's not the finishing point, but as a starting point, saying it doesn't matter which one we pick of our projects or our initiatives as number 1, but let's make something number 1. So that in a situation where the two of us are needed to work on it, let's say you're working on number 1, I'm working on the third thing, you need my help, I should probably stop working on number 3 to help out on number 1. And the reality is that at least for most organizations, they get so much benefit from just finishing any of the things than they get from spreading the effort around. And it removes a lot of these questions around like, oh, I have a dependency on you. Yeah, the problem is not the dependency, it's how long it takes to resolve it. But at least if we're resolving, the 17th thing on the list last versus the first thing on the list last, we get a better outcome. And so it just gives people a little bit of a tool to say, this thing is the number 1 thing. Please can everybody treat it as the number 1 thing. Like, don't drop everything. Not everybody has to be involved in it, but at some reasonable level, if I ask for your help on the number 1 thing, please, jump in.
Yeah, I mean, that's really, that would be really useful to do more explicit. I was just thinking like 4 directions at once, but it feels like also one of those things that is more common to do like within a team or a part of the organization than the whole organization. And it's that classic thing, well, like, we've decided to work on these things, this sprint or what have you, and we have a clear priority. And then something comes in from sales or customer support.
To each have their own list of the top 6.
Yeah, exactly. And this one is really urgent, and this one is a really big tender. And yes, please don't make it a personal Slack message to me, because that won't lead to a good balance of things.
Exactly.
And I mean, it could definitely be the right decision to drop everything for the tender thing, even though we didn't know about that 2 minutes ago.
Yeah.
It might be best for the whole organization, and that critical bug might be 2 people affected, and they can wait.
Exactly.
And also the thing I thought was important this week, totally unimportant. Or it could be that I should just ignore everything and focus on that one.
Yeah. I think you highlight exactly... you highlight what I so often see happening is that I don't think it's on purpose, but we go and create a list of things like the top priorities for everybody, and we tend to do one of 2 things. We make everything is number 1 priority within the team. It's like, these are all the number 1s, those are all the number 2s. It's like, no, you can't only have one number 1. Like that's how it works. Like otherwise you're putting things in priority buckets and then you're weighting it, and that's a different thing to actually prioritizing it.
Yeah, we're actually doing.
Yeah, even within that, you still have to pick number 1 from the number 1s.
Yeah, exactly.
So do that. And then the second piece of that is then doing it across the different teams. And I see it so often that it's like, people are like, but like they're basically just arguing like about, but this is the number 1 thing. It's like, for you. And for me, it's a totally different thing. And at no point did we get together and say, okay, so which one will actually go first? It's hard to do this. It's really difficult to do this. But where I've seen organizations doing it, even just saying, this is the number 1 bet for the company, this is our top priority, whatever it is, doesn't mean everybody jump on it. It means either help when you need it, focus exclusively on this thing, or stay out of the way.
Yeah, exactly. Don't interrupt them with.
Don't go and harangue them about questions about way down at the bottom of the list.
Exactly.
Like, it's like, hey, you've got a tender, but I'm shipping this other thing. So,
Yeah.
And what you can do with that is you can also start to look at the patterns that emerge. Like, are there certain types of dependencies that always occur? Could you do something to address that? And if it's constantly blocking your number ones and you see this repeating pattern, like, you always need marketing for a certain thing, and marketing is not available, well, you could address that. Could you teach some of the folks on the other areas some stuff about marketing? Could you involve them earlier in the process, connect the planning a little better, this kind of thing? So there's usually not a lack of solutions.
No.
It's often the opposite. We have more ideas than we have capacity to deliver. And so what we actually need to do is get better at cutting some of those down.
Yeah.
But it's hard to cut. Because if I say to you, we'll cut the bottom half of the list, that would be a great idea, but most people won't do that. So I rather flip it around and say, at least be clear on what's at the top.
Yeah.
And get good at treating that as number one.
Yeah, and find some good way of not making the priorities another 2-hour meeting with too many people in it. Because that happens pretty easily as well, doesn't it?
I can't believe the number of times I've sat in a meeting inside a company or with an organization that I'm working with, where they'll talk for... I was in a planning session once where it was about 25 people had flown in from all over the world to come and have this meeting. Mm-hmm. The entire conversation happened about planning the next quarter. Mm-hmm. And then someone said at the end of the meeting, but we actually don't have capacity to do any of this stuff because we're already committed from last quarter. And so I was kind of sitting there just going, I don't understand. Yeah. Like, why did you even have this meeting? Like, you're talking about something that's just not the priority. Like, surely as the leaders in the org, you should be talking about the most important things. And if they're on track, and if they're not on track, just go, well, we don't need to talk about what's next because we're still going to do that stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
The number of times, like status meetings, reporting, getting in the way of moving the most important stuff forward so that you can have a better conversation about something that's just not going to get done because it's so far down the list. It's just like, why? Why are you doing that?
But if we did do that, we would have a really good idea about it now.
Yeah. Cool. And
it's good for you.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
And it gets harder, obviously, the more people that are in the organization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you try to distribute more, and then you get those priority contra priority interface challenges instead.
So what we do with Flight Levels often is try to look at creating something like a virtual organization around that. And so you have your sort of the common structure. So you have the Flight Levels metaphor is quite simple. There's operations on the ground. That's the teams that do the stuff. It could be hiring people, running marketing campaigns, building software, whatever. Some group of those people need to come together to build a thing, whether it's a value stream or a product or an initiative of some kind. And so you create something that visualizes one level of abstraction up and says, these are the components or the pieces or the chunks of that we're going to deliver. And you align again, first, second, third. And then you connect it to the strategy of the organization. And if those three start to connect, what you're able to do is actually say, okay, for a short period of time, this group of people for the next quarter, 2 quarters, 6 weeks, whatever, are going to work on getting this thing out the door. So we're going to create some sort of a virtual structure. We're going to visualize the things that they're focusing on, and they're going to focus their energy on that. Yeah. And at some point, maybe we don't need that structure anymore because we've delivered the thing or we're doing something else, and we can, go back to doing things the way we were doing before. But just having those 3 different levels sorts out some kind of abstraction level so that you can actually tie what do I do today to where are we trying to be 5 years from now.
Yeah.
And it's
get a bit more feeling that you're working in the right direction.
Yeah. Rather than just being busy.
Yeah.
How is it actually moving us towards the goals?
Yeah.
We did this thing. We found a great opportunity. Should that affect the strategy for the company? Strategy is working really well. We're ahead of target or we're behind on target. How do we adapt?
It's interesting stuff. Networking people.
I think it's a case of trying to get the right people talking to the right people at the right time, and the right teams doing the right things at the right time. It's like, doing analysis work 6 years before you build the thing. I don't know. It's probably not so useful by the time you get around to building it.
No, maybe it was a fun exercise though.
Sure,
but yeah, people are interesting. Yeah, I think we covered a lot of the stuff I had written down.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to add that people should be thinking about or shouldn't be thinking about?
I think there's something really interesting in a couple of the talks at the conference. We're sitting here at the NeuroDev, and there were a couple of talks talking about this idea of the responsibility specifically of software development folks to take responsibility for, I guess, like ethical, moral questions and these kind of things. And obviously one of the big things that we talk about in the current situation is around climate change and all of these kind of things. And I think very often, as somebody was saying, I forget which of the talks was mentioning it, but it's like we sort of had this idea of that, like you can either do good or be in business, and that those two things actually, for some reason, don't align. But the reality is that it's very possible in many cases to take both of those two things into account.
Yeah.
Like nobody's saying you can't make money and have something that is not just climate neutral or not making the environment worse, but perhaps you could even make it better at the same time. And I think there's something really interesting in that space, because so often what we're doing is I think we're consuming so much of our energy just trying to deliver the stuff that we've done.
Yeah.
And because we're not looking at the outcomes and the impacts, and that's kind of sort of the meta point of trying to be better with flight levels and all of these tools, is that it gives us the opportunity to actually reflect on the impacts that we're having both within the company and on the bottom line, but also on the larger environment and society as a whole. And I think it's really important because we just so often we fall short of that because we're not really thinking about the second order effects and, sort of externalizing something. Like I outsourced this problem to somewhere else, but now, all of the waste is sitting somewhere in South Africa being dealt with, and not so cool. So I think it's possible, and I've seen it quite a few times where organizations are actually doing a much better job of taking care of those kind of things. And I think part of the reason why I'm excited about trying to move the conversation, I don't think we'll necessarily get to a point where everything is just, like organizational design is a solved problem. Like I think there are some parts of it that have been solved for certain contexts, perhaps. But it's a case of like, okay, in which context can we use these things? But if we can move beyond just the trying to get stuff done, we can get into a better conversation. Like, is that the right stuff to do? And there's, of course, many, moral, philosophical, ethical, business like questions inside that.
Yeah.
And so I'm excited about where that conversation evolves into. And as I was saying to somebody the other day, I get so tired of like, conversations, should we estimate this way or that way? It's like, I get why people are having those conversations still, but at the end of the day, like, let's also elevate some of the conversation around the actual impacts that we're having. And I think we have a responsibility as individuals who are aware of these things to exercise that, not just go, oh, well, it's just my job.
Try to do some good with the power you have available.
And don't see it as somehow like, you can either do good or you can make money. It's those two things can happen at the same time.
Yeah, of course. It was a smaller thing, but the first keynote, it's always time for tea. I was almost a little bit annoyed that he made such a good case for like deadlines can be a good thing. It's one of those, I don't want to accept it, but he has such a good point, and it's not always a negative thing, but the focusing power of something that has a time, a date and time stamp attached to it. It's actually not always a bad thing.
I think there's so many sort of almost contradictory and paradoxical things in our industry, which is like, you want to just kind of get on with something rather than theorizing about it. But then you can quickly also end up in sort of the move fast and break things, which usually means that if you move fast, you break things. And some of those things, I get the sort of metaphor, like small things, don't overthink it. But like when you're affecting things on a global scale, I think that's before you get to that point, you need to start kind of questioning like, well, what is the positive impact or what are the outcomes? And how do we accept responsibility for those kinds of things? But of course, on the other hand, you also need to kind of, not spend too long overthinking the solution before you start. And so there's always this kind of tension between having a deadline and just, going until it's done. But you could also use something that is sort of a rhythm that says, well, every X amount of time we'll check in and see how we're doing. And so we force ourselves to have a deadline, if you will, but you can still make a decision of, is it done yet and should we continue? But if the default is that, well, we're always going to roll over and spend another cycle on it, it's not really a deadline.
No, it's
so.
I mean, I think that's my problem with deadlines, because I associate with those like made up dates.
Yeah.
Someone said the date here, and nobody really believes it, so nothing particular gets delivered that day either. And 2 weeks later, someone asks, and then you had 2 more weeks to sort of fiddle around.
So something that I like about this, because I think when you're doing something like, I would think of it sort of like through the lens of budgeting. You don't want to be in a situation where you're trying to prioritize like in the moment between eating, sleeping, or, like you have to do a bit of both.
Yeah.
And so if you actually allocate some time to these different things, but when you think about something like a deadline or, allocating a sprint, a quarter, something like this to do the work, partly what you're doing there is you're saying, if we spend this much time, can we get a certain amount of benefit? So we're sort of forcing ourselves to bite off a smaller chunk.
Yeah.
And I think this is partly the point that he's making, is that it can actually be helpful to have, yes, nobody dies on that date. Like we've had this conversation, we realize this, but just letting yourself go unconstrained, you might end up 6 years down the path.
Yeah, exactly. Nothing happens, and you haven't really answered any questions because the person wasn't available or what have you.
It's a little bit of cost benefit, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, it occurred to me that that's the reason some important bugs are such good focusing functions, because they're really a deadline. Because if the customer can't do X by a date Y, like tomorrow afternoon, things will blow up. So this is worth fixing. This is worth fixing right now. Now I can focus, and I don't worry about my 3 priority ones or what have you.
Exactly. I saw this fascinating thing. A friend of mine, Troy McGinnis, was talking about this a couple of times. He talks about dependencies and forecasting and stuff. And what he said was fascinating was that everybody kind of said in large banks, for example, big corporates, we can't be agile because, everything. Then COVID happens, and suddenly within a space of a few weeks, there is this hyper-focused sort of push to get everybody working remotely, Zoom set up, whatever, this kind of thing. Yeah. And the reality was that for almost every one of those organizations, they delivered in an extremely agile fashion. Yeah. People were talking every day and planning. There was a clear number one priority, and stuff got done. Yeah. And then you kind of like, see, it worked. Like you can do it. Like, sure, like we don't necessarily want to have another pandemic in order to create that situation. But are there some things that we could learn from this experience and go, like maybe we could be doing slightly less than...
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you managed to ship like desks to people's homes and stuff like that. You don't usually do that.
That sense of urgency.
Yeah, like, exactly.
People got why that was important to sort out. And like, I think it's fascinating to see organizations that would tell you they would never ever do it. I mean,
well, you did do it.
You did. Look at it.
Maybe people are more agile than they think if they just thought to look in the right way.
Yeah. I think that's the thing in those sort of situations, like you have no option to do it. And somehow, it's a choice. Like you can not do it, but that choice also has consequences. So people like, adapting as a company it's not essential, but neither is the company's survival. That's not essential.
No, that's true.
If you want to, you probably need to respond to some changes in the market and the general dynamics, but there's no imperative there.
No.
Like it's
nobody's forcing you.
No. So make your choices.
Yeah. I guess maybe that's a good point to end on. Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, it was great.
Let me put it this way, Mr. Raymer. The 9000 series is the most reliable computer ever made. No 9000 computer has ever made a mistake or distorted information. We are all, by any practical definition of the words, foolproof and incapable of error.